today, I'm going to, of course, mostly what we're talking about today is Greek culture. That's pretty much the last thing I usually talk about, ancient Greece, before I move on to get into talking about the Macedonians, the Hellenistic age of Alexander the Great, all that. So one of the first things I am going to be talking about today, of course, is the Olympics. When you talk about the Greek Olympics, which is, of course, a big thing that happened in ancient times. Of course, the Olympics were pretty prestigious, not just now, but back then. People that were in the Olympics were like really great heroes to people. People looked up to them. I think if you won a certain event, pretty much you got a free meal for the next 4 years, that kind of thing. So people idolized them. I think there's even a case where they found graffiti written on walls of great athletes where they'd say Ajax is a great athlete. Of course, some other fan would come behind and scratch it out and say, no, he's not. That kind of deal. But anyway, they weren't just the Olympic Games. The ones I'll get to, of course, that were at Olympia in the northern part of the Peloponnese. They actually have 5 different games that were put on at one point. I'll bring this screen up here. Let me close that out, and I'll bring up the screen for you to look at, the PowerPoint. There are 5 games, actually. They had the Pythian Games. The Pythian Games were held at the city-state of what is Delphi. Delphi, it's like in Boeotia, and it was these games that were put on to honor, I don't know if you know what Pythia was. Pythia was this oracle. It was a woman that would tell your prophecy. They would put on games to honor her, basically. The Isthmian Games were held at Corinth, close to where the Isthmus of Corinth is. So they had that one. They had the Nemean Games were held at Argos, which is in the northeastern part of the Peloponnese. And the Pantheon, you may have heard of that one, it's probably pretty famous, was held at Athens. That one honored games that honored the god Pan and also the goddess Athena, like both of them, basically. So, but those weren't as prestigious as the Olympic Games. Those games were held at Olympia, hence the name. It was called Olympic, not from Mount Olympus, but from Olympia. Olympia is located in the northwestern part of the Peloponnese Peninsula, kind of west of Argos. It was held every 4 years. They believe the first Greek Olympics were held maybe in 776 BC, and that's traditionally been the famous year when they think Greek culture kind of begins, like the whole Hellenic or Greek age they always talk about, though probably before that, but that's they think when it started. So they first started putting on the first games there. And you can see they were held every 4 years, every 4 summers. They would hold these games, which that's actually a unit of time. It's now called the Olympiad. Today the modern Olympics are held every 4 years, like the Summer Games every 4 years. Hey, come on in. And the Winter Games are held every 4 years too. So the same kind of deal they have today. Olympia was famous for this huge temple that was there called the Temple of Zeus. It had a huge statue of Zeus inside of it that people would kind of worship and give offerings to. And the Temple of Zeus was actually one of the 7 wonders of the world, according to the Greeks at one point. And so athletes actually had to come before this statue of Zeus and take an oath, like some kind of Olympic oath or whatever, that they had trained as an athlete for the Olympics. And so people have come from all over Greece and I guess the Mediterranean world later to basically participate in these games. You know about it, they had usually an Olympic truce that would take place where a lot of city-states would put down their arms and they wouldn't fight and all that. And a lot of athletic sports that are, that were done in the original games are still put on. Although I think some like the pentathlon is not done anymore, but sports that were in the pentathlon were, later adopted, overall as athletic type competitions, which aren't just done in, Olympics, but track and field type stuff they do professionally in college sports, also as well. The one that they talk about as athletic events, I'll kind of get into that are famous. I'll tell you about the Pentathlon. Pentathlon was one of the oldest ones and probably the most famous event, which later they had some version they replaced called the decathlon. You may have heard, where they have 10 events where they got to go through, which is ridiculous. I think they still do the decathlon, and they have the triathlon, right? Where it's like running, biking, swimming, that they have kind of like that. 5-sport athletic event. Of course, it's got javelin, discus, which I think both those may have come from like warfare, Greece, long jump, Greco-style wrestling, and running. So those are the 5. Whoever did the best, in all 5 of the events of the pentathlon, would, of course, win, basically. I'll talk in a second what they won. I'll get that in a second. But they didn't win medals, if you know about that. They had blood sports. Of course, boxing, which had been around, was probably their big blood sport. They had one called pancration, which pancration was like kind of like Greek martial arts, or like mixed martial arts, which kind of like a cross between wrestling and boxing. Today they call it MMA, mixed martial arts, and that's where MMA came from. It's a variation of pancration today, which is real popular, on TV and all that now. Then, of course, Greco-Roman style. Not the kind of wrestling you watch on TV, like the WWA or whatever. But yeah, Greco-style wrestling that they do in schools, like high school, college, I think, still today. Those are considered blood sports, even wrestling, believe it or not. Some of those were fought to the death, like pancration, I think, was sometimes fought to the death, sometimes in some cases. And sometimes there was hardly any, like, rules. You could even bite the guy's ear off or something like that. Another one that was real popular was chariot racing as well. Chariot racing was real popular in the Greek-Roman world because of horse racing, and gambling and very fast. People would get killed quite often. They've seen like Ben-Hur movies like that. People would get killed, a lot of times. So chariot racing was big. Like later in the Roman world, they had the famous Circus Maximus. Byzantine Empire had the Hippodrome, where they enjoyed chariot racing and all that. Oh, about women too, with the games and all that. A lot of the games were segregated between the men and the women. The women had their own games that they participated in, which were called the Chariot Games, which were games that honored the goddess Hera, which was the wife of Zeus, which were mostly running type sports, which happened about the same time when they would put on the men's Olympic Games overall. And supposedly, like the games were like the men's games were kind of segregated in the fact that the only the married women supposedly could watch, and not the like single women. I'm not sure exactly why, but I guess it's kind of weird about that. That's basically something like that or whatever. But anyway, but a lot of the competition were in the nude. That's something you probably know about. They didn't wear any clothes hardly. Although I've got some pictures showing like the chariot races where they maybe, but yeah, there's different theories about why they were nude. But I think the main reason was because of the fact that the aerodynamics and stuff like that. They thought that, the body could, do better. Also, the Greeks thought the body was like a work of art, created by the gods. So I guess they're showing their body off for the gods, how great their body is. They'll often like cover themselves with olive oil and things like that. They didn't win any medals. They got like different things, like a olive wreath, I think, was put on their head. It's kind of like a medal. I think they were often given like jugs of olive oil, which was real expensive. Like olive oil's, not cheap, that kind of thing. The games were later banned. The Romans, over time, after close to about, I want to say 1,100 years or more, eventually got rid of the games. The reason for that was because of the rise of Christianity that started throughout the Roman Empire. And so it wasn't seen as being very Christian to run around naked and worship like pagan gods. So it's kind of like this pagan spectacle, according to what they believed. And so there was an emperor named Theodosius the First, or they also call him Theodosius the Great, who reigned in the late 4th century, around the 390s. I forget what exact year. Yeah, it might have been 393 CE. It might be the exact year. That's when it got banned. They got rid of them. So Olympic Games, no more pretty much after that. But in modern times, as you know, the Europeans, like in Britain and France and other countries, mostly in Western Europe, decided to bring back the Olympic Games. Why did they do it? I think it was part of an attempt to create camaraderie between different countries where they would compete in sports instead of maybe fighting wars, which Europe had done for years against each other. So in 1896, a lot of the European countries decided to create the first Summer Games, or first modern Olympics, which were held at Athens. And of course, the reason why they held it at Athens, was because of Athens being the birthplace of democracy and, Western civilization and all that. And then later in the early 20th century, early 1900s, they added the Winter Games, which they rotate, every 2 years. You've got a winter or a summer game, but each rotate every 4 years or an Olympiad. Oh, by the way, when they first held the first games, Greece, believe it or not, won the most medals. That's interesting about that, the first Olympics and all of that. It's at those games, too, by the way, that the marathon run was actually developed in 1896, which honored the whole Phidippides run that I talked about when I was kind of covering the Greco-Persian Wars. So that's kind of a new sport they invented. But they had all kinds of other sports that they had there. I think they had bicycling and other things like that. They had other sports they added besides the original games. I don't think the shot put was something they had till later. Things like hammer throw, they kind of add that later, and so on. I do have some pictures, of course, showing some of the images of the events they had. There's the long jump, which was part of the pentathlon, and apparently they would use some kind of weights to help propel themselves with the long jump. Chariot racing, I think they had different kinds. They had either, 6-horse chariot racing or maybe 4. They had different versions. I know they had where they had multiple chariots, multiple horses with chariots. Here's some Greek pottery showing, like on the left, some runners. They got also pancration, I think is right here. You see, right? It looks like kind of a combination of almost looks like MMA, like there you're looking at Greco-Roman wrestling. Here's some old pictures. Discus throw, the javelin. Oh, there's one I forgot about, which was very interesting. They had one called the Hoplitodromus race. It was the hoplite race, which was kind of comical. They actually had men that would dress up like hoplites, like wear their armor, probably soldiers, and they would actually have like a race, like 100 meters race in armor, which was crazy. I guess they added about the 6th century BC, but it's something they did have as example. So it's all kinds of games, and so these are kind of like the whole Olympic Games is something that influenced later. Modern times, modern Olympics, which now modern Olympics are more, professional. They let all these professionals come in. And I think that was a kind of a bad idea, but that's something that they did and commercialized it even more after that. All right, let me move on. I'm going to, of course, talk about next. Let me get into, of course, and talk about also Greek culture as well. I need to also talk about the so-called drama play that they have as well. Let me see. That's the next thing there. And the drama play is something that the Greeks were kind of very famous for, especially the type of play that you probably have heard of, which was called the tragic or tragedy type play, where usually there's a character, maybe a hero or somebody that has a downfall. Something bad happens to him or he dies quite often as well. And the Greeks were big into, they were very serious, the Greeks, overall. And anyway, they had comedy type plays that they would put on, but quite often they would put on trilogies of these types of drama plays that were, like I said, that were tragic overall. A lot of the the playwrights that go back to ancient Greece, there's not too many that have survived. In fact, I put it on the list here for you, but there's only 4 actual Greek playwrights from ancient times that have actually survived, like with their works in general, which I think was the amount of works that they had total. But it was like, what is it? Looks like about 43. I think 43 plays total is all basically that have survived from ancient times. And some of them wrote a lot, like Sophocles wrote, they think at one point, 120 plays. That's a lot that he wrote, but not very few of them are around still today. They're just lost to history at one point. Aeschylus, of course, was one of the first to write Greek plays, like tragic type plays. They consider him to be the father of the Greek tragedy type play. He wrote about 70 plays total. Only 7 actually survive. That's it. His most famous set of plays was a trilogy. In fact, he's the father of the trilogy, of the 3-part play or 3-part story, which was Orestia, which is a tragic play about the house of Atreus. It talks a story about Agamemnon coming back from the war, his wife Clytemnestra killing him. He actually murders him. You know about that. So it's kind of the backdrop of the period after the Trojan War, kind of like Homer's like the Odyssey, after the war. It's a 3-part play. I think the first play is called Agamemnon. That's well known. So he was the first really to write plays. Of course, that second one on the list is Sophocles, who I told you wrote 120 plays, which is the most ever written out of all the old Greek playwrights. And a couple of his plays are about this character named Oedipus. Of course, you've heard about Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King. That was his greatest play that he wrote. And it's, by the way, considered to be the greatest tragic Greek play ever written. It's like a classic. It tells a story about Oedipus, who there was a omen that he was going to kill his father and marry his mother. And so if you know about it, his parents got rid of him. And later on, we know what happened. He ended up killing his father and marrying his mother. So a lot of the plays have irony in them. A lot. He's got a play about Ajax, who was a Greek hero, the Trojan War. He does have another play about Oedipus called Oedipus at Colonus, I think. And the Antigone. The Antigone is another famous play by Sophocles. That's well known. Euripides actually became more popular later. It's because, for some reason, more of his plays survived. Euripides wrote about 95 plays. Only 18 survived from ancient time. So he became very popular, especially by the time of like Alexander the Great. He was big. And his most famous play, of course, was called Medea, which is actually a play about divorce, believe it or not. It's a story about Jason the Argonauts, which is big in Greek mythology, where Jason decided to divorce his wife, Medea, and marry this younger woman. And so she got angry about it and basically killed their children and fled and got away with it or something like that. So it's kind of like that Medea character, to the actor that does the Medea movies. Not the same thing, though, but same name, though, pretty much. But anyway, and they have one more I'll give you, too, that's very famous, which is Aristophanes. You've ever heard of him? He's another famous Greek playwright. He wrote what they call comedies, or satirical type plays. Aristophanes is actually the father of comedy. He's the one who invented comedy to entertain people. He wrote about 40 plays, and 11 survived from ancient times. And he had several plays that were very famous. I've got 2 of them up there. Lysistrata is kind of like a real big play now, so I think people still put that one on. Lysistrata is actually a anti-war play, one of the first to really ever be written. It's about the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War. It's about like mostly Athens, I think, at the time. There's a woman named Lysistrata. She's mad that all the men want to go off to war, and so she comes up with this idea to try to stop war by have all the women go on a sex strike where they won't have sex with their husbands or whatever. And I think in the end it failed, I think. But that's what it's about. It's an anti-war play. The Clouds is another famous play by Aristophanes, which was a satire making fun of Socrates. He was a famous Greek philosopher. And a lot of people blame Socrates for the decline of Athens at the time. I don't know why, but basically that's what it's about. And so they put on these satirical type plays. I think he's got another one. The other one's called, what is it, The Wasp? The Wasp, what some other ones he had? The Wasp and a few other plays that were big as well. Can't remember the other ones. I forgot those. But anyway, so that's basically about, Greek drama. Now let me get also into philosophy as well, which is probably one of the greatest things that the Greeks were known for, and that's the invention of philosophy in the Western world. Most of philosophy in the West was influenced either by Greek or Roman thought, quite a lot. So up through medieval, even into modern times, there was a lot of influence from it. And the word philosophy comes from the Greek word philosophos, which means in Greek, you can see there, either love of wisdom or love of knowledge. And they think Greek philosophy goes back close to 2,600 years ago, roughly. There was a man named Thales of Miletus. They think he was the first Greek philosopher, so they consider him to be the father of Greek philosophy. He was also a mathematician, which a lot of philosophers were, if you know about that. And a long time ago, philosophy was basically everything. It was all knowledge, like even history, like we're talking about, of course, it was a form of philosophy. And I know up to modern times, they called, like science was called like natural philosophy and things like that. That was actually used. And then in modern times, they started separating everything into separate subjects and stuff like that. Of course, the first great philosopher that they always talk about is Socrates. You know about him. And yeah, he was the first great philosopher overall. You can see there. And according to the oracle at Delphi, Socrates was the most wisest man in all of Greece. Although he said famously, "I know that I know nothing." Was his famous quote. I guess you can't know everything. Is maybe what he's really meant. But he supposedly was like really smart, probably kind of like a polymath, knew everything. And he set up one of the first philosophical schools in Athens, which taught a lot of different students in Athens, the city-state. They didn't really have a name to it, though. But there's one thing that Socrates was famous for. He was known for a teaching method that was called the dialectic method. The dialectic method was a type of teaching tool, basically where he would ask his students questions, and then from, I guess, whatever the answer was, they would basically, it would encourage more insight into, what they're talking about. So if they're wrong, you would explain why, and then if they're right, you would, I guess, give them positive feedback and things like that. They also later call it the Socratic method, as you know. As Bill and Ted said, Socrates. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. Joke. But anyway, now Socrates, by the way, is a very tragic figure. If you know about it, he was put to death. And basically he was given two options, either face death or ostracism. And what happened was it was like the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War, and people blamed him for it. He was kind of like this scapegoat, if you want to call it, or why Athens was declining, really wasn't his fault. It was, they had bumbled into these wars with other city-states like Sparta. But he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, maybe, I guess, egging them on to war. I don't know. And so at his trial, he made a famous quote, which was, "The unexamined life is not worth living." Is what he said. And he had a choice. He could either death, like kill himself, or exile, like ostracism. And he actually chose death instead. He could have gone into exile. But I think the reason why he didn't do it was because, well, one, he was so old. He was like close to 70 when they condemned him to death or exile. So what's he going to do? A 70-year-old man, leave. And then I guess he'd rather die than not be able to teach students or whatever, So that's basically what he meant by the quote. So yeah, tragic figure. They made paintings about it, which you may have seen before. Like the most famous is The Death of Socrates by Jacques-Louis David, made in the 18th century, of course, most well known, where he's getting ready to take the hemlock, which is a type of poison, before he dies. So that's kind of a very romanticized painting, but it kind of shows, what's going to happen there. Then they have Plato, of course, who, of course, very more famous than really Socrates. Plato is really considered to be the greatest Greek philosopher. His brand of philosophy is later called Platonic philosophy. You've probably heard of that. And yeah, he was Socrates' best student or pupil at his school. He wrote a lot of the dialogues down between Socrates and his students. So we kind of know what Socrates said, because Socrates didn't write anything down, if you know about that. And you can see he lived mostly between the 5th and 4th centuries BC. And the one thing that Plato is very famous for, he started a school in Athens, you can see there, that was simply called, really, the Academy, just Academy is what they called it. And it was considered to be the first school of higher learning. They taught philosophy, which, like I said, was everything at the time, whether it be math, science, the arts, whatever. It was all taught there. Sports, they taught athletic stuff, sports. They had sports. They taught also military stuff too. If you want to become a soldier, that kind of, they trained you, things like that. You can see the word academics, the word academia, and all those other words you've heard of that similar to that are all evolved from the word academy. And by the way, the word academy supposedly came from a Greek hero of some type, like a man who was named Academos, hence the name. That's what he named after this guy, apparently. And the school was around for a while. Let's see, it was started around, like it says up there, 387 BC is when it started, but it was around till Roman times. And the Romans were heavily influenced by Plato's, school. They say Platonic philosophy influenced like Christianity, like Christian thought and things like that. All the early church fathers that were in the Catholic Church were heavily influenced by Plato, like St. Augustine, etc. He wrote a lot of books, of course, Plato. That's one thing about Plato. He wrote a lot of philosophical works on different topics. Those are probably his two most famous works. One is the Apology of Socrates, which covers also, Socrates' trial. He's put on trial and all that, and his death. But his most famous work is the Republic. The Republic is actually more of a political science type work, more or less, about what the perfect society is in general. And it's not a republic, believe it or not. Yeah, not a republic. It's actually a type of state where it's a monarchy. Plato believed the monarchy could be really the best form of government if the ruler is highly educated. He called it a philosopher king, I think was the term he believed. So maybe like a constitutional monarchy, maybe he's kind of talking about more or less. Yeah, the monarchy in a sense is the most stable form of government over time. It's lasted the longest overall. But the term republic is kind of evolved from that, like republican kind of evolves from that, of course, later. Now they also have another philosopher usually talk about. Of course, there's the school of Athens. That's sometimes, by the way, what they sometimes dub the academy. I think some people call it that, from a famous painting done by Raphael, who was a Renaissance painter that did most of his work in Italy in, I think, the early 16th century CE. So there's a famous thing. I think in that picture you've got Plato's in the middle here. And the guy on the right is another man in blue here, which is Aristotle. Aristotle would go on to be really probably the smartest out of the different philosophers. He wasn't actually from Athens. He was from Macedonia. He was a Macedonian Greek philosopher. He was actually basically Plato's best student at the academy. After he finished graduating from there, he actually taught there for a bunch of years before he went back to Macedonia for a while. He was a polymath. He was a genius. I think Aristotle pretty much studied just about anything you could think of. He studied biology, physics, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, poetry, plays, music, rhetoric, politics, government, economics, you name it. He studied the like astronomy too, I think. So he was into studying everything. I'll get to later, but he was big into the sciences, about that. Of course, one thing that's very famous about Aristotle, if you know about it, was the guy that taught Alexander the Great. He was actually his teacher for a few years, probably in middle school, high school would be probably age, roughly in Macedonia. Because after he left the academy, like he was teaching there for a while, he went back to Macedonia and created a Greek school there, gymnasium type school, for the king of Macedonia, which was King Philip II, or Philip of Macedonia. It was actually formed to teach a lot of the nobility's children. So that's how he met Alexander the Great. He heavily influenced Alexander. They think he may have, influenced Alexander to want to conquer the world. And Aristotle gave him a personal copy of the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, which he had notes written in it. The Iliad was, by the way, Alexander the Great's favorite book. They like to read all that. Now, he went back to Athens, Aristotle, and he formed a school which has different names. It was called, some people call it the Lyceum School, like a philosophical school. But it's called Lyceum because it was actually in a temple in Athens called the Lyceum Temple. So hence the name. So it was in part of the temple. But this started in 334 BC, you can see there. But they actually didn't call it that. The Greeks called it the Peripatetic School, because apparently what he would do is he would walk around in different parts of the temple and he would teach his students. So I guess some students over here, some students over there. It's kind of like college, universities, where a professor goes from one classroom to the next, like that, which we're not doing because it's all online, I guess now, stupid virus. But anyway, that's basically why they call it peripatetic. I think it means the walk around school, I think is what, because peripatetic means to walk around. Maybe he had ADD or something. He couldn't stay still, that kind of thing. Maybe so. I don't know. There's Aristotle. Now, also the Lyceum, I want to talk about too, but it's famous for getting into a lot of empirical studies, which, dealing with science and reason and stuff like the natural science is one of the big things that he was into. He was really big into biology and botany. And apparently when Alexander was conquering like the East, like Persia, he actually sent him specimens back, animal specimens and plant specimens. And so he was kind of obsessed with that, like plants and animals and of the world. But he says he's kind of like an early biologist, if you want to go at that. They think that his school influenced a lot of science, Greek, Roman, medieval science after that. Like you've ever heard about the four elements, earth, air, water, and fire. They think his school kind of helped develop that idea. Also, you heard about the geocentric theory or model. of the solar system, where all the planets and the sun revolve around the Earth. That he helped develop that too, his school as well. So I think by the time of that, you heard of Ptolemy. He was a famous Egyptian geographer. He kind of invented some of these ideas later that were kind of influenced from Aristotle. And so that's kind of where all that came from. Now, there's some books he wrote, but he wrote all kinds of books like physics, metaphysics, Nicomachean Ethics. That one right there might be his most famous book, which is about ethics. And Aristotle was the one that invented the idea of what they call the mean, something that's between two extremes, kind of like Buddha talking about the middle path and all that. The mean is something he kind of invented. The middle path between two extremes, like Buddha. So anyway, kind of talking about these philosophers. There's other philosophers too, like you heard of Diogenes, and there was other philosophers that were big later, that came along that followed after that. All right, let me move on. I need to also next talk about Greek mythology. So that's the last thing I'll talk about, and I should have time to hopefully go ahead and review before I finish this lecture today. Now, the Greeks also had an extensive pantheon of gods. They had probably hundreds of gods that they worshiped overall, but chiefly there were some main gods that they worshiped the most that were also heavily influenced on the Romans later on. They were called usually the 12 Olympians, what they actually called them. Of course, some people call them Olympians for short because they lived on Mount Olympus. The Greeks called them dodecathion, which meant actually 12 gods. That's what they dubbed them. And these Olympians were a race of gods that had basically taken over the world, like in ancient times, like a long time ago. And they had a leader, of course, everybody's heard about, which is Zeus. Zeus, is the one that would basically lead them. And they think there were some other gods before them that had controlled the earth, which were called the Titans. I'm sure were these giant primordial gods that had ruled the earth forever. And gods like Uranus, Gaia, who they called Earth, his wife of Uranus, Kronos, you probably heard of Oceanus. They also had Prometheus, Atlas. So all these gods were gods that had ruled the earth. And then the Olympians came and, of course, defeated them. And a lot of them were banished. You know about this. Prometheus was chained to a rock and stuff like that. Atlas was made to hold the earth up and so on. Kronos, of course, one of their gods, of course, one of the sons of Uranus and Gaia. He, of course, was the father of the Olympians, the 6 gods that would really take over the earth afterwards. And the 3 male gods, of course, that were very famous were Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They were all brothers, sons of Kronos. And of course, you can see there they divided up the earth between them. Zeus got the sky, Poseidon got the oceans, etc. Hades got the underworld, basically. And they also had these sisters of theirs, of course, which were sisters of Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, which were Hera, Hestia, and Demeter as well. So we'll get to them later as well. You can see on the bottom, they had also had some other famous gods that were also well known as well. Of course, the main children of Zeus, you see there, he had other children too that were like from people that were mortal. But Athena, Apollo, Dionysus, Aphrodite, Hermes, Artemis, Ares, Hephaestus, those are the main ones, of course, that were famous children of Zeus, which were part of, supposedly the Olympians, the 12 Olympians. Although Hades is usually not counted because he lives in the underworld. But most of those gods you see in yellow would live on Mount Olympus, which Mount Olympus, by the way, is in northern Greece. And believe it or not, the Greeks actually believed that the gods lived there. It's crazy about that. But I think during Roman times, they were like, nah, not really true. But because like the Romans later don't really believe as much into the mythology, as the Greeks did. The Greeks thought like the Iliad was like the Bible, to like people today. So Now let me get into the gods. Let me I've got a bunch of slides to show you real quick on the different gods they have. Of course, I said Zeus, you see there, of course, was the father of the gods. He was known as the Thundermaker because he had a weapon that Hephaestus made for him, Vulcan, which was like a thunderbolt, basically. And so he's the one who often made thunder when they'd have storms. And the Romans later called him Jupiter, just later one of the planets of the solar system. They also called him Jove, was another name, because the Romans would sometimes have a saying that they would say, by Jove, or something like that. Yeah, he's the supreme god. So he's the father of the gods, the one that's the most powerful, the son of Kronos, god of sky, lightning, and thunder. Of course, married to Hera, who of course, the Romans called Juno later, and who was also his sister. Which is kind of sick, I know, but, but basically, now she was known for all kinds of things. Mother goddess, I know. So she was associated with marriage, children, things like that, childbirth. And if you know about Zeus, he was often known for cheating on her, Hera. So he's a big philanderer. And so the two they don't get along. I guess because they're brother and sister, that kind of thing. Poseidon, of course, the other, of course, brother of Zeus. Get to Hades in a second, but Poseidon was known as Neptune. He was known for a weapon too, which is, of course, the famous trident, which is like a pitchfork-looking spear. He was the god of the oceans, also the god associated with the earthquakes. Supposedly, Poseidon was the god that made horses, supposedly, mythology. He lives actually beneath the ocean. He has his own palace. But he kind of goes back and forth between the ocean and Mount Olympus. So he's pretty powerful god up there with Zeus. Probably the second most powerful. Then Hades, who was also often called Pluto. Actually, Pluto was the name a lot of people called him, actually. Pluto was a kind of a planet too in the solar system. He's another brother of Zeus as well. He, of course, is the god of the underworld. It's kind of named after him, if you know. And so people really called him Pluto. So he's the god of wealth, apparently. He's also known for having a weapon, which was called different names, but they usually call it the cap or cape, usually cap, of invisibility. Or I think another name they call it is the helm of darkness. He has this helmet he wears, and it makes him invisible. And like the legends of or myths of Perseus, you know about Perseus, famous Greek hero, he actually has that famous weapon or armor, I guess, where he puts it on his head and makes him invisible. Also, let me talk about the sisters and all that too. Yeah, the sisters, I'm missing some slides. I don't know why. Where are they? Oh, because I skipped them or I just left them out. I think I left them out. Oops. I think I left all the gods out. But yeah, of course, they have Hestia, of course, the other sister as well. And Hestia is the goddess of the hearth. She, of course, is very important because she deals with the home. The home, and like the Greeks would keep like a eternal flame that they would have, and she was later called another name, which is Vesta, which the Romans had like various priestesses that would, of course, be important with her. I'm trying to find another slide I'm missing, which I don't know where it is. I'll look and see if I can find it in a second here. But then you have Demeter, another sister, of course, the goddess of the harvest, the grain, and agriculture. She, of course, is very important with farming in general. She had a daughter that was very famous named Persephone, that was married to Hades. And she was associated with usually like the seasons. Like when she would go into the underworld. They'd have winter, and when she would come back, things would warm up, and they would have spring as well. I don't know why, but I'm missing all the different gods, but I guess I can go ahead and talk about them. I'm trying to find them, the other gods I'm missing, but for some reason I'm missing them. Let me see if I can find them real quick here, but man, I'm trying to think where they could be. The other gods, lost them for some reason. That dog it. Know what happened. They must have got erased. Hold on, let me see something for a second here. I'll see if I can find them. For some reason, they're not on here. I don't know why. Let's see. Freak. Didn't know that would happen. Well, they're missing for some reason. Well, let me just talk about them real quick since I don't have them on there. But the other gods, they have two, which I can go in the list. Like if you go to the review down here, I can talk about them real quick. But the other gods, the children of Zeus, real quick, Athena, who they call Minerva, of course, is the Athenian goddess, like the patron goddess of Athens. She was associated with war and also culture and art in general. So a daughter of Zeus. Apollo, of course, was the put that on the screen for you can see it. But Apollo didn't have another name. Apollo was called also by the Romans. Apollo was the god of like sun, light, poetry, prophecy. He was pretty important also as well. So he was big. Artemis, also called Diana, was the goddess of the hunt, the virgin goddess. They sometimes call her the virgin huntress. That's what they called her, Artemis. Usually had a bow and arrow and all that. So hunters would worship her. Hermes or Mercury was a god associated with mostly commerce, money, also athletics, like athletes, and also, believe it or not, thieves would worship Hermes because he was very fast. He had wings on his feet. Hermes was the messenger god of Zeus. You kind of go back and forth and tell Zeus what's going on in the world. Aphrodite or Venus, we already talked about her before, but she's the goddess of beauty and love. She has a son named Eros or Cupid, who's the god of erotic love or sexual love. Ares is the god of war. They also call him Mars, the Romans. Ares was not that popular with the Greeks, but was very popular with the Romans. Hephaestus or Vulcan was the blacksmith of the gods. He was the one that made the weapons for the like gods like Zeus and Hades and Poseidon. And he was known for like dealing with like fire and metallurgy. Dionysus, of course, also called Bacchus later by the Romans, of course, was the god of wine, fertility. He was like real popular in the Greek-Roman world. They had a lot of parties and orgies that would be put on. And a lot of the plays we were talking about earlier, were put on in honor of, So those are some like minor gods they have later, children of Zeus overall. Now I got a few minutes left. Let me go ahead and review over, of course, the main stuff. I don't know if I'll do the Greek gods. We'll just review since we just did that. I'll go ahead and review these two slides that I've got here. I can show you, which are on the review sections on the Greek culture we just talked about. So we got the Olympics first. What were the Olympics? When did they supposedly begin? The Olympics, of course, started about 776 BC. These, of course, were a series of one of five, I told you, Greek games that were put on in ancient Greece, done every 4 years. They were done at Olympia in the northern Peloponnese, of course, hence the name, of course. What were some sports athletic events associated with the Olympics? I told you they had the pentathlon that they had. They had, of course, I told you all these different games they had, like the javelin, the discus throw, the wrestling, foot racing, the long jump. Were all big. Boxing, Greco-Roman wrestling, pancration. I told you about chariot racing. Don't forget about the hoplite race. That was another one I kind of added there later that was also well known. And of course, running games were, all there that men and women, of course, did and all of that. Olympics were later banned, of course, by the Romans. They think under the Roman Emperor Theodosius the Great or Theodosius the First. He got rid of the games maybe in the 390s BC. So they got rid of the games. And then the modern games were brought back, of course, which were done in 1896 at Athens in Greece. So that's where they held the first modern games, which were the summer games. And then later they had winter games, of course, later over time. Here are some examples of Greek playwrights and their plays. I told you that Aeschylus was the father of the Greek play. He was known for the trilogy plays that were called the Aristia, which was about the Trojan, really the post-Trojan War period of the house of Atreus. And then talk about Sophocles. Sophocles was the greatest playwright, really, of them all. And he was like the Steven Spielberg of the Greek playwrights, basically. And I told you he wrote like 7 plays, but the most famous play was Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, which is still a great play today. They've done different workings of it, of course. I told you also another play with Euripides was another great playwright. He had the most plays that survived, like 18. He had one play called Medea, I told you about. And then Aristophanes, of course, was the greatest comic playwright. The only ones that survive of comedy-type plays. And he had plays like The Clouds, and I told you about Lysistrata also as well. Then we talked about philosophers. Of course, the first great philosopher was Socrates, I told you about. And he was the one that was known for the dialectic or Socratic method, which is a type of teaching tool, or I think the term they use is actually pedagogy type of tool they use for educating students using like a questioning and answering format. So it's like you ask me a question later on YouTube about this lecture or other lectures, and I'll give you an answer. That's kind of like the dialectic method, more or less. Also, on the other slide, I'll give you real quick. What was Socrates' best known pupil? What school did he found in Athens? That, of course, was Plato, of course. And his school is called the Academy. And, of course, that was considered one of the first great schools of higher learning, kind of like a university, etc. What are some works of Plato? I told you the Apology of Socrates was one, and then his most famous is the Republic. That's the one everybody is forced to read usually when they take a philosophy class, especially on the Western world, Greek world. What fields of study did Aristotle? Of course, who was Plato's greatest student and philosopher? That, of course, was Aristotle. Was really the greatest that came after that. He had his own school, of course, called the Lyceum, also called the Peripatetic School in Athens. And it was a school that actually did a lot in like scientific fields, empirical type studies, natural studies, which I told you about. Whom did Aristotle teach that became a famous Greek conqueror? Of course, Alexander the Great. I'll talk about, of course, next week. Very famous. We'll talk about Aristotle. So Aristotle went on to teach Alexander the Great, one genius to another, that kind of thing. Then we talked about who are the Olympians and all that. The 12 Olympians, of course, I told you about. Again, we can go through them real quick if you want. I got it in a minute or two if you want. But Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, of course, the 3 main male ones, of course, that are famous. Then you've got Hera, Demeter, and Hestia. So they're all brothers and sisters that you've got. Of course, the other 3 on the bottom there, you can see there, you got Zeus, I told you, that inhabited the sky. Poseidon, of course, took over the oceans. And then Hades, or Pluto, they called him too, also inhabited, of course, the underworld as well. Now, I forgot those slides there. I don't know what happened with that. Sorry about that, this lecture. But, of course, had all the children of Zeus. Of course, I told you about. I just talked about those already. But there you can see Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, Aphrodite, Ares, Hephaestus. Those are all part of the 12 Olympians as well. They're counted, not the ones on, usually Dionysus and Eros are not considered the original 12 Olympians. Now, I told you Hades didn't really reside on Mount Olympus, so a lot of times they don't count him either. So there's kind of a debate about that. It's kind of controversial, I guess, about who should go in there or not, all that. But anyway, that's pretty much my lecture, of course, on ancient Greece. Overall, of course, part 1 through 4. I'm probably not going to have a quiz on this period. Like I'm waiting, of course, I'm kind of working on the second exam coming up. So mostly I think ancient Greece, also the Macedonians, is going to be pretty much mostly the next exam coming up. I'm going to have like some stuff on China on the exam too, number 2. But most of your tests, I'm saying 80%, maybe more than that, it's going to be all Greek, pretty much stuff, Greek and Macedonian overall. So next week, I'm going to, of course, move on Monday next week, lecture-wise. I'm going to get into and talk about the rise of the Macedonians and Alexander the Great and the so-called Hellenistic age. I love that period. It's one of my favorite period on the Greek period. So I'll try to do that in one lecture if I can, even if it's a little longer. I like to try to get it all done, get that out the way, because you got the second exam coming up later and all that. So, like I said, later this morning, I'm going to get this lecture up on my YouTube channel. So, if anybody has any questions, comments, let me know. If you got some kind of question. If it's an administrative problem too with the class, just let me know. Email if you got a question about something else, more or less. Don't forget, I've got assignments, of course, up to in the week and the week before. So I got a bunch up still. I think the one on India is still up. I got the new one on China up. I'm going to do that one. And then you got the new video quiz on the Battle Thermopylae to work on that one also as well. So that's it for the week. So I hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. So like I said, let me know if you have any comments, questions about this lecture. And I will post this to my YouTube channel afterwards. So y'all have a good week and all that the rest of the week coming up. So take care.